carrier. There was a group of destroyers or a squadron of destroyers would be assigned to run with each aircraft carrier. It had several functions. In case a flyer had to ditch before he could land on the carrier, the destroyers were there to pick him up. The destroyers were there to protect the aircraft carriers from other attacks, from plane attacks and things. We had 5-inch guns on the destroyer, plus we had 40 millimeter guns and 20 millimeter cannon guns and things like that, which were used to shoot at airplanes if there was planes that were coming to attack, because we were out in the perimeter, sort of around aircraft carrier, and each aircraft carrier had a group of destroyers that usually ran with it, and usually probably also a light cruiser or two also. They had these units that were designated as for a specific function.
I guess let's start getting into some combat.
Well, I
what
think
would happen during some combat battles with you in particular?
Well, being assigned to one of these units, for a long time we were with what was called the 7th Fleet, which was the fleet that was involved in the battles in the south part of the Pacific. All the islands that were invaded by both the Army and the Marines. And one of the functions, if it was a Marine invasion, destroyers were used a lot of times as the artillery for the Marines. Before there would be bombings of these islands beforehand from the carrier planes and things like that. And then when the actual invasion occurred, there were transports that would take the Marines ashore, and the destroyers would be within seeing distance of wherever they were landing, and using our 5-inch guns on the destroyer, they would act as sort of the offshore artillery pieces or close-in artillery support for the troops that were landing on these islands. So you could actually see the island from, you could see the fire going on and things like that. And we participated in several of those landings. At Peleliu was one of the islands, and Truk was another island that we were involved in.
Now, would you be on the deck for a lot of that when you?
No, because I was below deck.
Yeah, because you had to make sure.
Although there was a hatch, and even though you were supposed to be at general quarters and everything was locked down, sometimes that you could go up the ladder of the hatch, and you could go and sort of look around through this small hatch from either the engine room or the fire room and see what was going on. But most of the time you couldn't. You just could hear. You could hear the firing, and you could hear what was going on.
Wow. Did you guys, did you ever have any active, I guess, strikes against you guys? Do you recall?
Oh, yeah, we had planes, Japanese planes. I can't remember, and submarines. That was one of the functions of the destroyer, was that make sure that no submarine was able to sink an aircraft carrier. We constantly were, we had sonar in those days. It was sonar, and they were always searching for underwater craft that might be. And let's see, if I remember right, when I was on the Stevenson, we may have sunk, confirmed, I think, before you could paint something up on your stack or bridge, it had to be a confirmed kill. May have sunk 3 submarines and probably shot down, maybe it was 4 Japanese airplanes that had attacked a carrier group, and we happened to be in a position to shoot and knock down somebody.
You talked about being involved in 9 battles. Or most of the ones you're talking about is just going to island to island.
And the biggest battles was the Battle of the Philippines, which it was called, I think one of the famous battles was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was, and another major battle was the Battle of Midway, where we practically destroyed the ability of the Japanese Navy to do any further attacking in the Pacific. And the war pretty much, and that was early in 1942, or I say early, I think it was in June of 1942, where we sunk several of their aircraft carriers. Our flyers from the carriers that we were guarding, and Admiral Spruance was in charge of that, but Admiral Nimitz was the overall admiral. But they had broken the Japanese code, and they had positioned our fleet well north of Midway, and the Japanese were going to come and take Midway. They were going to have an invasion of this island of Midway. And when their planes left to attack Midway, our planes left to attack their carriers. And they didn't know that. And we sank, I think we sank 3 carriers in that battle and sank several of their heavy cruisers. It was really a decisive battle that our flyers did at Midway. That was in June of 1942. And the Japanese from then on were really fighting a defensive war instead of an offensive war. And then the bigger battles that we were involved in is the Philippines was invaded. And after the Philippines was invaded, they decided that they started preparing for an invasion of Japan. So they decided that they invaded Okinawa, which was a big Japanese stronghold, which we participated in. The Navy did a lot of the bombing, Navy carriers along with Army bombers, softening up those before the land invasion occurred. And the Battle of Okinawa, which was primarily spearheaded by Marines and then Army. And those were where we had significant losses in those particular battles in terms of the land losses, because the Japanese just didn't want to surrender, and especially Okinawa, Iwo Jima, which was just almost like a big volcanic rock out there that they had so fortified, and everybody, they were all in caves and bunkered places, and it just took, they just fought, the Marines and the Army just fought from cave to cave on that island to take that island. And of course there was the famous picture of when they took the island of Mount Suribachi and the raising of the flag. That was really, wasn't the end of the battle there, but because the battle went on for several days or several weeks still after that.
And your particular unit surrounding the air carrier, did you guys lose any destroyers there?
We never lost any destroyers in the squadron. In fact, though we lost 2 destroyers at the Battle of the Philippines. It had nothing to do with, it had to do with typhoons. The ships were, the weather had been bad for several days, and they were the destroyers didn't carry a lot of fuel. They had to frequently be refueled when the aircraft carriers could carry a lot of fuel. And the weather was so bad and the weather was so rough that we couldn't fuel from the aircraft carriers, and whatever happened, it didn't happen on our ship, but we were in this typhoon, which is like a hurricane. They call them typhoons in the Pacific. And wind speeds of 150, 160 miles an hour, and waves 40, 50 feet high. And the aircraft carriers had to run in one direction, and so we had to run in the same direction with the carrier. Well, it was not the most safe way for the destroyers to run. And a couple of the destroyers capsized because they didn't have enough ballast, And when the ship would roll over, it never came back again, and it just eventually capsized and lost a lot of people. Were lost on. I remember there were 2 destroyers lost. We fortunately.
Were you involved in the rescue of those efforts?
No, we didn't. It wasn't in our squadron. It was another
Okay,
squadron
you heard about
that it happened to, but it was in that whole group of the 7th Fleet that it happened, which was rather tragic. I remember when our ship would roll, you would sometimes think it's not going to come back. It would get down to where it was over 60 degrees, and you'd say the ship would just be shuddering, and then it would eventually roll back up again. Very hair-raising.
During during that particular storm, you were involved in the same storm, obviously.
Yep.
What were you? Anything
I
special
was
happening
wondering.
with the boiler?
Well,
or were you guys just
actually,
holding on for your life?
actually, I was then a warrant officer, and we had to have the ship I was on was called. It was like a step deck destroyer, the Buchanan, as it was the Stevenson. They were the smaller destroyers. Destroyers that came along later in the war were a little larger and a different configuration. So there was a deck, and then it went down, and there was another deck, and so then there was a second deck level. Well, in the weather, to go from one to the engine room or fire room, from the front to the rear, there was a cable that ran and a trolley on the cable, and you could hook your arm in this for safety reasons to go, and I had to go from the front engine room to the rear engine room during this storm, and I do remember that. And with the ship rolling and everything, and me with my arm in this, and the wind, and the water felt just like it was cutting you. It was so salty water, wave water, mist, but at high gust wind, wind speed. Anyway, I remember once or twice getting from the front of the ship to the rear, being no ship under me. I was just hanging by my arm. The ship had rolled, and I was there,
Above.
and it would roll back again.
Wow. Perfect. Do you remember any specific casualties that happened in your unit,
No,
your ship?
there was none on either one of the ships I was on. We had no casualties.
That's impressive. Now you had to take some damage, right? Tell me you guys at least got shot by a Japanese plane.
Well, we got shot at, but we never got hit.
Wow.
That happens.
Wow.
You know, sometimes the gods shine on you, I guess.
I just assumed you would always get hit with bullets. I
Nope,
guess.
we never did.
Let's see here. Didn't receive any injuries. Guess I gotta ask you a little bit about the awards and medals you received. About.
I never got those until here a couple years ago.
Oh, really?
I had my discharge, and I knew that I was eligible for them,
Yeah.
and I had no idea how to go about getting them. I think one time we were out in Iowa to visit my mother, and I always used to pick up the USA Today out there to read that paper. And there was a small article in the paper about how you could go about getting your ribbons and medals.
Wow.
So I cut that piece out, and then we came back home, and I decided that I'm going to send away for them, because it told you exactly what you had to do. You had to send them a copy of your discharge and all the Navy records. And I'm not sure whether all service records are in St. Louis, Missouri. There's a central location there, and that's where you had to write and send a copy of your discharge and request that they send you the medals or whatever that you were entitled to.
I thought they just automatically would send them to you.
If they did, I just had never had them. And that's what I did. I sent away and I got them. And after I got them, I didn't know what I was going to do with them. And it just so happened that I guess I got a catalog one time of a company in South Carolina that is in the metals business. And they put displays together and things like that. And I called them and sent the metals to them, and they put the display together.
Wow, nice. Let's talk about life on the boat. I guess first off, how did you stay in contact with your family? What was that process like?
Mail, just mail. They had it was these short, it had a specific name, and it escapes me what the name of it was. Some kind of specific mail. I only had a mother and a father at home in Iowa, and I think I wrote them fairly frequently, wrote my mother fairly frequently. Of course, all the mail was censored then, so you couldn't say where you were or anything like that.
Talk about the food on the ship. What was that like?
The food was pretty. It was certainly better than the Army. When we always had a place to eat, and the food was, as I remember, it wasn't too bad. And when I got to be an officer, the food improved quite a bit.
Do you still think about any officers or fellow soldiers?
Not really. I really have never kept up with anybody that I was in the service with. Once I got out of the service, well, I got married when I was in the service, and once we got out, we moved to New York, and I just never heard of any reunions or anything of any of the ships I was on, and just kind of lost contact with anybody that I was in the service with.
Did you keep a diary at the time? Or?
No, I didn't.
I guess tell us a little about the day that you received your discharge.
Well, when I got to be an officer, I decided I was going to make the Navy a career. But in the meantime, in 1946, I had gotten married. I had been corresponding with a girl while I was in the Navy through a friend of mine on the ship who was a chief petty officer. And his wife and her both worked for a government office in New York. And I guess I saw a picture of her or something with